Monte Carlo, July of 1891. The casino floor of the Société des Bains de Mer hums with the low murmur of 1,000 carefully composed conversations, roulette wheels spinning in their gilded orbits, the soft click of ivory chips shifting hands beneath the chandeliers. Outside, the Mediterranean glitters like hammered pewter in the afternoon heat. Inside, everything is controlled. Everything is curated. Everything always belongs to the house. And then a man sits down at table 5. He is not young, not handsome, not particularly remarkable to look at. He is 50 years old, broad in the shoulders, thinning on top, with the modest clothes and the confident posture of a man who has spent a lifetime talking people into things. His name is Charles DeVille Wells. He arrives with a modest sum, by some accounts as little as £4,000, by others somewhat more, and he begins to play roulette. What happens over the next 3 days will shock a continent. Wells will break the bank at Monte Carlo not once, not twice, but so many times that the casino will drape the tables in black mourning cloth like the dead, while staff scramble to replenish the chips. He will walk away with more than 1 million francs. He will become the most famous gambler in the world. He will have a song written about him. He will be celebrated across Europe as a genius, a legend, a folk hero. And then the truth about Charles Wells will slowly come out. And the truth, as it always does, will be far stranger, far darker, and far more fascinating than the legend. This is the story of Charles DeVille Wells, the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo 3 times, the man who was celebrated as a genius, and the man who turned out to be one of the most audacious, confident swindlers of the Victorian age. It all began not on the glittering shores of the Riviera, but in the gray, ordinary England of the 1840s, in the life of a boy who learned very early that the world would give you whatever you were bold enough to claim. Charles DeVille Wells was born in 1841 in Broxbourne, in Hertfordshire, a quiet market town just north of London, the kind of place where ambitions grow slowly and modest men stay modest all their lives. His father worked as a music teacher. His mother kept the home. They were not poor by Victorian standards, but they were not rich either. And young Charles grew up understanding the particular frustration of a man who can see the better life just beyond his reach. He had a quick mind. That much was obvious early. He absorbed numbers easily, understood systems intuitively, and had a natural gift for making other people feel that he understood things they did not. Whether that gift was genius or performance, and with Wells, the line between those two things would always be blurry. It set him apart from the other boys in Broxbourne. He had an engineer's brain, or at least he could convince people he did, which in the Victorian industrial boom was almost the same thing. By his 20s, Wells had drifted to France, drawn by the energy of a country still rebuilding after the upheavals of the century. He settled in Paris for a stretch, learned the language, absorbed the culture, and began constructing his identity. The identity of a man of science, an inventor, a technical genius standing on the cutting edge of industrial progress. He filed patents. He talked to investors. He described in compelling detail devices and systems and inventions that he claimed would revolutionize transportation, communication, manufacturing. Some of these inventions may have been partially real. Others appear to have existed only in the conversations Wells had about them. But in both cases, the outcome was the same. Investors gave him money. In exchange, Wells gave them promises. And promises, as any confidence man knows, are infinitely cheaper to produce than working machinery. Over the years, Wells refined his method. He understood that wealthy men want to feel clever. They want to feel they've spotted something others have missed. Give a rich man the sense that he's in on a secret, that he alone has seen the genius in an invention that the world hasn't yet recognized, and he will give you his money almost gratefully. Wells gave men that feeling, again and again. He collected their investments and he used them not to build anything, but to sustain the lifestyle of a man who seemed, from the outside, to be exactly the kind of successful inventor businessman worth backing. He ran schemes in England and France throughout the 1870s and 1880s. When things got too hot in one city, he relocated. When a particular story wore thin, he retooled it with new technical jargon. He was persistent, adaptable, and utterly untroubled by the moral weight of what he was doing. By 1890, Charles Wells was almost 50 years old. modestly comfortable on other people's money, and increasingly in need of a dramatic move. That move would come from an unexpected direction. Because of all the things Wells was known for doing, the patents, the scams, the investor meetings over brandy in Parisian drawing rooms, gambling was not one of them. But there was a casino at the edge of Europe, perched on a rocky promontory above the Mediterranean, and it had been doing something no casino should ever be allowed to do. It had been capturing the imagination of the world. The Casino de Monte Carlo had opened its grand new building in 1878, and by the early 1890s, it was the most famous gambling establishment on earth. It attracted royalty, industrialists, artists, and adventurers. It attracted them with its marble floors, its sculpted gardens, its views of the sea, and most of all, with the whispered promise that here, if you were clever or lucky or divinely favored, the laws of probability might bend for you. The management of the Société des Bains de Mer knew perfectly well that the casino would always win in the long run. But they also knew that some players would have extraordinary short-term runs, and that those runs were excellent for publicity. Wells knew about Monte Carlo. Everyone knew about Monte Carlo. But in the spring of 1891, something shifted in his thinking. He had been collecting money from investors for a device he called a musical jump, a patented invention, he claimed, that could revolutionize the music industry. He had taken in a significant sum from backers in England. He had no particular plan to deliver anything, but he did have cash, and he had time, and he had been reading accounts of men who had sat down at the Monte Carlo roulette wheels and emerged with fortunes. He began to think seriously about a system. The system Wells had in mind was not new. It was, in fact, one of the oldest betting approaches in the history of gambling, the martingale. The idea was simple and, on paper, seductive. You begin with a base bet. If you lose, you double the next bet. When you eventually win, you recover all your losses and gain the original base amount. Mathematically, if you have infinite money and infinite time and no table limits, the martingale cannot lose. The problem, of course, is that no human being has infinite money, and no casino allows infinite escalation. Table limits exist precisely to destroy the martingale at its critical moment, the moment when a long losing streak demands a bet so large it breaks the player before the wheel can save him. Wells understood the mathematics. He was not naive. But he also understood something that mathematicians sometimes undervalue: variance. In the short run, over the span of a few days at a single table, the variance in roulette is enormous. Losing streaks and winning streaks cluster. Wheels run hot, and if a man arrives with enough capital, applies discipline, and catches a genuine hot streak with the martingale amplifying every win, the numbers can become spectacular. Whether Wells had truly done the calculations, or whether some part of him simply had an instinct, a gambler's gut sense that his moment had arrived, we will never know for certain. What we know is that in July of 1891, Charles DeVille Wells booked passage to Monaco, checked into a modest hotel on the hillside above the harbor, and walked through the doors of the casino for the first time. He bought chips at table 5 in the main gaming room. He placed his first bet. The wheel began to spin. What followed was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary sequences of luck ever recorded in the history of organized gambling. Wells ran the martingale. He bet. He doubled when he lost. He pressed when he won. And the wheel just kept landing in his favor. Not always, not cleanly. There were moments of tension, moments when the required doubling bet climbed high enough to make other players at the table go quiet and watch. But Wells never broke. He never showed the slightest tremor, and the wheel kept coming back. In the first session alone, Wells won so much that the table ran out of chips. This is what the casino management called breaking the bank. Not the institution itself, but the individual table's working supply of chips. When a table ran dry, the management would drape it in a cloth of black. Not mourning, technically, but the association was hard to miss. And suspend play while new chips were carried out from the vault. The ceremony was theatrical, but the emotion behind it was genuine. Tables were not supposed to run out of chips. Players were not supposed to win at that rate. Wells broke the bank at table 5 once on the first day, then twice more. He came back the second day. He broke it again, and again. Over the course of 3 days, By the count that has come down through contemporary newspaper accounts, Charles DeVille Wells broke the bank at Monte Carlo 12 times. He walked away with somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 pounds. Accounts vary, and Wells himself was not the most reliable narrator of his own exploits. In francs, the most commonly cited figure is over 1 million. At the time, that was a sum that would have sustained a middle-class family for several lifetimes. Europe noticed. The story of the Englishman who had broken the bank at Monte Carlo spread through newspaper offices from London to Vienna like fire through dry grass. By the time Wells returned to England, he was being received as a kind of hero, the plucky Englishman who had walked into the most celebrated casino in the world and beaten it senseless with its own game. Journalists wanted to interview him. Society hostesses wanted to entertain him. Investors, naturally, wanted to give him more money. Wells was characteristically oblique about his method. He told different interviewers different things. Sometimes he hinted at a mathematical system. Sometimes he spoke of intuition. Occasionally, he claimed to have developed an entirely novel approach to predicting roulette outcomes that he could not, of course, share publicly. He was never specific. Specificity, after all, invites scrutiny. And the last thing Charles DeVille Wells needed was scrutiny, because the money that had funded his Monte Carlo adventure was not his. It had come from investors who believed they were financing his inventions. He had taken their capital, walked it to the south of France, and gambled it. And he had won, spectacularly, impossibly, in a way that defied reasonable expectation. But his investors still thought their money was going toward patents and prototypes. Wells would need to manage that reality carefully. He managed it by doing something that any good confidence man would recognize immediately. He used the winnings to create the appearance of legitimacy. He paid some investors back. He made generous gestures. He told a story of a parallel success. The gambling windfall, yes, but also the invention business proceeding splendidly in the background. The prototypes coming along, the patents almost finalized. He was calm and convincing because he was always calm and convincing. And besides, hadn't the man just broken the bank at Monte Carlo? The man was clearly touched by fortune. Who would doubt him now? He spent the summer of 1891 in London, celebrated, comfortable, moving through the social world with the ease of a man who has just proved something. He took on new investors. He told new stories. He accepted the admiration of strangers and smiled the comfortable smile of a man who knows that the world's attention is finally fixed on him in exactly the right way. But there was one thing he had not yet done. He had not gone back. The casino was waiting, and something in Wells would not let that be the end of the story. Because what he had done once, he believed he could do again. The system that had made him a legend, was still there. The wheel was still there, and the bank at Monte Carlo still existed. In November of 1891, 4 months after his first visit, Charles Wells returned to Monte Carlo. He sat down at the tables. He applied his system. The casino, which had been studying his play during his July visit, watching for any sign of illegal manipulation, had found nothing. He was simply a man who bet with discipline and won with extraordinary frequency. They welcomed him back. What else could they do? The November run was, if anything, even more remarkable in its way. Wells broke the bank again, multiple times. On one evening alone, he broke it 6 times in a row, a feat so statistically improbable that decades later mathematicians and gambling researchers would still be puzzling over it. In total, he left Monte Carlo again with a fortune comparable to his first visit, somewhere in the region of hundreds of thousands of francs. His running total now across 2 visits was extraordinary. He had done what no gambler in modern memory had done. He had walked into the greatest casino on earth twice and beaten it twice. By now, he was not merely famous, he was mythological. Fred Gilbert, a music hall songwriter in London, had written a song called "The Man Who Broke the Bank at Monte Carlo." The song was performed at the Oxford Music Hall by Charles Coburn and immediately became one of the most popular songs in England. It told the story of a man walking through the city, confident and prosperous, unable to escape the knowledge of what he had achieved. It made Wells into a character, a gleaming icon of nerve and luck and English pluck against the continental establishment. People sang it in pubs. Children sang it in the streets. Charles DeVille Wells heard it and smiled his private, complicated smile. He was spending money lavishly now. He had acquired a yacht, a small but handsome vessel he named Palais Royal, and he sailed the Mediterranean aboard her with a woman named Jeanette Burns, who was not his wife, but who was treated by Wells in every other respect like one. Jeanette was younger than Wells, pretty and lively, and she had attached herself to his rising star with the instinct of someone who understood that proximity to a man like Wells was either the best or the worst decision she would ever make. Wells entertained on the yacht. He wore good clothes. He stayed in the best hotels when he wasn't aboard. He maintained the investor correspondence that kept new money flowing in, new victims, technically, though Wells would never have used that word. He spoke easily and confidently about his inventions, about the musical jump, about other devices he claimed to have in development. He produced paperwork. He produced letters. He produced the absolute conviction of a man who has nothing to hide, which is, of course, the primary tool of every man who has everything to hide. The world at this point was dividing cleanly into two camps regarding Charles Wells. One camp saw him as what he appeared to be, a gifted eccentric, a mathematical genius perhaps, certainly a man with extraordinary luck, who had achieved something almost supernatural at the roulette tables of Monte Carlo, and was now living, deservedly, the good life. The other camp, smaller, quieter, consisting mostly of men who had invested in his inventions and found the returns slower than promised, was beginning to ask harder questions. By the early months of 1892, Wells decided to do something that, in retrospect, was either extraordinarily bold or catastrophically reckless. He decided to return to Monte Carlo a third time. He arrived in the spring. The casino management received him with the careful courtesy one extends to a man one considers a natural enemy. They had studied the tapes. They had consulted with mathematicians. They had examined every angle, and they had found nothing. Wells was clean. He was simply, impossibly, winning. They raised the table limits slightly. They quietly adjusted procedures. They would not be fooled again by whatever mysterious system this Englishman was deploying. Wells sat down. He began to play. And for a while, for a glittering, maddening while, the magic held. He won. He broke the bank again. Not as many times as the first visit, not as dramatically as the second, but he won. He was up by a significant amount. He was pressing forward, martingale in hand, riding a streak that the laws of probability kept insisting had to end, but that kept stubbornly not ending. And then something changed. It is hard to pinpoint the exact moment because these things rarely have exact moments, but somewhere in the third visit, the tide began to go out, a series of losses. The doubling bet climbing higher and higher. The chip stack that had been growing for days suddenly starting to flatten. Wells stayed at the tables longer than he should have. He made the classic gambler's error, the error that every system player eventually makes, of believing that the system itself was more powerful than the mathematics, that discipline and nerve could override the long-run inevitability of the house edge. He had won over 1 million francs across his first two visits. By the time the third visit was over, he had given back a significant portion of it. He had not been destroyed, not yet, but the halo was gone. The third visit was reported but not celebrated. The newspapers that had lionized him in 1891 were quieter now. The song was still popular, but the man it was about had begun to look, just slightly, like a man who had overstayed his welcome at fortune's table. He returned to England. He returned to France. He returned to his investors and his letters and his increasingly elaborate explanations. And behind all of it, moving slowly, steadily, the way these things always move when they are finally in motion, was the law. It was not the casino that brought Wells down. The casino had no grounds. He had cheated nothing, broken no rules, done nothing but play roulette with an outrageous run of luck and a disciplined system. It was the investors, the men who had given Wells money for his inventions, and there were many of them, spread across England, across France, across the social spectrum, from working-class savers who had scraped together £100 to wealthy speculators who had committed several thousand, had been waiting for returns that were never going to come, because the inventions, in most cases, did not exist in any form that could generate revenue. Some barely existed in any form at all. Wells had spent their money on himself. on the yacht, on the Mediterranean lifestyle, on his gambling stake. In late 1892, a woman named Miss Phillimore went to the authorities. She had given Wells a substantial sum for investment in his devices. She had received nothing back, and she had found other investors with the same story. The complaint was lodged. Scotland Yard began making inquiries, and the net, which had been building for years without Wells fully appreciating it, began to close. On the 26th of December, 1892, Charles Deville Wells was arrested in Le Havre, France. He was aboard the Palais Royal, his yacht, his floating statement of prosperity, when French police came aboard and placed him under arrest. Jeanette Burns was with him. She was not arrested. She watched from the deck as the man she had been living beside for years was led away. His composure, remarkably, still largely intact. He had been charged with obtaining money under false pretenses. The charges were not small. The total amount that investigators eventually attributed to his frauds ran to somewhere in the region of £50,000, a staggering sum in the currency of the 1890s. It represented dozens of victims. It represented years of systematic deception, carefully maintained, carefully managed, built on the foundation of his technical-sounding inventions and his increasingly polished reputation as a man of genius. He was extradited to England. He was tried at the Old Bailey in London in 1893. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. Investor after investor took the stand. They described the meetings with Wells. They described the patents he had shown them, the technical drawings, the confident explanations of devices that would transform their industries. They described handing over their money. They described waiting. They described writing letters that went unanswered, making inquiries that went circular, realizing slowly that the returns Wells had promised were not coming because the products Wells had promised were not real. Wells mounted a defense. He claimed the inventions were genuine, that the delays were normal for developmental stage technology, that he had always intended to repay his investors once the devices reached market. He was articulate. He was composed. He had spent a lifetime in rooms like this one, convincing people of things. It was not enough. The jury convicted him. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Charles Deville Wells, the man who had broken the bank at Monte Carlo, the man who had sung about in music halls across England, the man who had sailed the Mediterranean on his own yacht with a beautiful woman at his side, was taken to prison. He served his sentence. He was released in the late 1890s. He was in his late 50s by then, his hair fully gray, the Mediterranean adventure a decade behind him. He might have faded quietly into the background of history. He did not. Because Wells, even in his 60s, even with a conviction on his record and a reputation that should have preceded him like a warning flare, tried again. He moved back to France. He constructed a new identity. He changed his name several times by some accounts and began running new schemes, new investors, new inventions, new promises of returns that were, structurally, identical to everything he had done before the arrest. He was almost 70 years old, and he was still running confidence schemes in the back rooms of Paris, still finding men who would listen to a well-dressed man with a technical vocabulary and hand over their savings. He was arrested again in France in 1912, at around 70 years of age. This time, the French courts dealt with him. He served time in a French prison. He was old now, genuinely old, and the years were accumulating in the way they eventually accumulate on everyone, even men who have spent a lifetime outrunning consequences. He was released. He had nothing. The yacht was long gone. Jeanette was long gone. Whether she had finally left him or he had finally lost her to the erosion of years and prison stretches is not entirely clear from the record, but she was gone. He was alone in Paris, old and broke, living in increasingly modest circumstances. The memory of Monte Carlo by now so distant, it might have belonged to another man entirely. Charles Deville Wells died in Paris in January of 1926. He was 84 years old. He died in poverty. He had no estate. He left behind no fortune, no family in attendance, no headlines comparable to the ones that had blazoned his name across European newspapers 35 years earlier. He was buried in Paris with the simplicity afforded to a man who has outlasted everything he once had. The song outlived him. The man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo was still being sung when Wells died. It is still occasionally played today, over a century after Fred Gilbert wrote it in a flash of inspiration after reading the newspaper accounts of that extraordinary July in 1891. The song does not mention fraud. It does not mention prison. It does not mention the investors who lost their savings, the woman who followed Wells across the Mediterranean only to find herself standing on a dock in Le Havre watching him be arrested, the old man dying alone in a Paris flat with no money and no one. The song only knows the glorious part, the walk through the city, the confidence, the luck. That is, perhaps, the final confidence trick that Charles Wells played. Not on a casino, not on an investor, but on history itself. He arranged it so that what the world would remember, what the world still hums when the melody comes to mind, is the legend of the man who sat down at a roulette table and beat a casino 3 times in a row. The rest of it, the victims, the years in prison, the poverty, the death and obscurity, all of that got lost in the music. What actually happened at those tables in Monte Carlo remains, in the strictest mathematical sense, a mystery. The martingale alone cannot explain results of that magnitude across multiple sessions. The casino found no evidence of cheating. No accomplice was ever identified. No mechanical device was ever discovered. The wheel has no memory, and the odds do not know who is betting. Everything Wells won, he won against the same relentless mathematics that eventually takes money from every gambler who plays long enough. Some people, the evidence suggests, are simply born at the exact intersection of nerve, timing, and statistical anomaly. They catch a streak so improbable that it becomes a story. And if that person also happens to be a con man with a genius for self-presentation, the story becomes a legend. And if there is a songwriter nearby with a good ear, the legend becomes a song. The wheel spins, the house takes its edge, the years pass, the money goes, and somewhere in the unchanging mathematics of a roulette table, the ghost of Charles DeVille Wells still sits, watching the ball, waiting for the moment that the whole impossible thing begins again.